Welcome back, and thanks for tuning back into the Autism Family Resource Podcast. We have another awesome guest on our show. Will Martin from Soar Autism Center is here. Soar Autism Center is doing amazing work, taking a fresh approach to autism care that's centered on whole family support, early interventions, and collaborative care. We'll be talking about everything from innovative therapies and programs to navigating the challenges families face daily. This episode is a bit longer, but we want to make sure we discuss various questions and concerns you may have related to ABA behavioral style therapy. Welcome to the Autism Family Resource Podcast. We provide guidance and insights for parenting neurodivergent children. From Pure Hearts Therapy, I'm your host, Brian King. All right, guys. Will Martin is a behavioral analyst and head of the Early Start Denver model implementation at Soar Autism Center. SOAR provides ESDM-based therapy to children with autism in the Phoenix and Denver metro areas. Welcome to the show, Will.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Awesome, Will. So as we get started with this podcast, I wanted to first start off by giving me some takeaways that you think our listeners may get from this discussion today.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm hoping I can communicate a little bit about the Early Start Denver model and the type of therapy that ESDM is really all about, and really share more of that with folks in Phoenix and just kind of across the U.S. I find people perceive it as a new model, but it's been around for 10 or 15 years. It's just kind of a lesser known approach to teaching and supporting kids with autism. And so I'm really hoping to share more about that and share a little bit more about what it looks like at SOAR, and hope to connect with some families around those topics.
Okay, awesome. And the Early Start Denver model is, for people who don't know, is a model of ABA. Let's first start off by tell me kind of who you are and how you kind of got into this space.
Yeah, for sure. So I have been in this field since 2011. And I kind of stumbled into working with people with autism. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was an undergraduate at St. Joe's in Philadelphia at the time, and I was studying psychology, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up, for lack of a better way to put it. And there was an autism center on campus at the university I went to, and so I was kind of like, well, that seems cool. I might check this out. And so I interviewed there, and they needed a lifeguard because there were swimming lessons as part of this summer program they were running. And I happened to be a lifeguard from a previous job. So it worked out that they were like, let's have you join this team here. And I just started to meet a lot of the kids that were served at this center that the team worked with. And I saw some of the strategies and approaches that seemed to be really individualized for the kids there. And I saw the progress that they would make over the course of the summer camp that they were a part of. And it was really, really interesting and really exciting for me to see and be a small part of. And so from there, I decided this is what I want to do. This is what I want to study. I want to help, people with autism. And so I applied to graduate school, and I was fortunate enough to attend a program that was focused on early intervention. And so I was trained as a developmental therapist before I was trained as a BCBA. So my practicum fieldwork hours were going to families' homes and working with kids with all sorts of different diagnoses, genetic conditions, Down syndrome, autism, all sorts of different needs. And that helped really open my eyes to the value of individualization for kids across, again, different diagnoses, different needs, different age groups. And so I did that for a while, and it was really motivating to participate in the early intervention system. I then have worked in kind of a lot of different settings. I've worked in home therapy for kids. I've worked in schools, specialized schools, and kind of general public schools, and in clinic settings. I would say the defining moment in my career was getting to work at Vanderbilt Medical Center, where I was a part of a research study that compared the Early Start Denver model to other types of ABA, specifically discrete child training for kids with autism, and looked at pros and cons of the approaches. Is one more effective than the other? I think sometimes there's a perception that kids have to have DTT, or it's the only way that kids can learn. And so even though it feels rigid or feels strict, we have to go down that pathway. And this study really kind of sought to answer that question. And the Early Start Denver model is more flexible, more play-based, more developmentally informed for young kids with autism. And what we found in that research study was that ESDM was just as effective as this other kind of more rigid form of intervention. And so from there, I was convinced. I was like, this is the type of therapy that I want to provide to kids and families. Luckily, Jen and Ian, the co-founders of Soar Autism Center, also thought that that was a compelling argument. And I joined Soar as a clinical advisor initially, and am now here full-time as our head of ESDM implementation. And yeah, that's a little bit about me.
I love that. You touched on a lot of different things there, and I'll kind of circle back on that right now. But yeah, it sounded like the individualization kind of really stuck out for you. I definitely appreciate that as an OT because every person's so different. And we all heard, right? If you met one person with autism, you met one person with autism. But as you were talking about the Early Start Denver model, you said you in that study, you guys were comparing it to DTT. What is DTT? Can you kind of give me more background on that?
Yeah, so DTT stands for Discrete Trial Training, and it is probably I would call it like the original form of ABA being applied to working with people with autism. Typically, and some people will argue different things about DTT. I'm not here to do that. I'm just going to tell you typically what it is and what I think it is. Typically, I find it to be a more structured and rigid approach to teaching kids with autism that involves repeated practice of skills in kind of an isolated or controlled context. And oftentimes to motivate children or people to engage in these skills, they're earning what I would call extrinsic or unrelated things or motivators. And so what that might look like is asking you to come sit at a table and practice, writing your name. And after you write your name 5 times, maybe I give you an iPad that you watch something that you like Daniel Tiger or something like that. It was the original kind of form of ABA therapy, and it's still practiced in a lot of clinics across the United States. It's still probably, I would say, the most common form of ABA therapy. And it has some real drawbacks associated with it, particularly around the rigidity and the developmental appropriateness for young kids with autism. I'm talking 2, 3, 4-year-olds. Thinking about, is this really how kids learn, and is it the best way for kids to learn? So that's my perception on what DTT is.
I'm not in the ABA world, so I definitely am trying to speak from a neutral standpoint, but also come with a perspective from a parent, or actually even an individual. They're definitely, from what I've heard and what I've seen, there's definitely a lot of pushback from ABA in the autism world. And I think it is a lot of that, what you said, the repetitiveness and extrinsic motivation versus the intrinsic motivation. So how would you say that Denver model kind of encourages intrinsic motivation, and maybe even an example of kind of what that might look like in a clinic?
Yeah, great question. So I see ESDM as different in a number of ways from DTT. One, it starts as a play-based intervention. So we are not sitting at tables. We are not doing repeated practice with unrelated materials. The first thing I'm trying to do in ESDM therapy is find something the child likes that I can do with them. And so I might set up the room with a couple different options, maybe a toy that's like kinetic sand, something that's sensory-based, maybe a puzzle or a shape sorter, and maybe a book or another type of activity there. And then I'm going to try and see what the child is interested in, or what are they indicating to me that they might be gravitating towards. And sometimes that's me waiting and watching to see if the child will kind of, approach a set of materials. Or I might want to show them a little bit like, this is how this toy works. This is an idea that you could try with this activity, see if that connects with that child. But before I try and do anything else in ESDM therapy, I want to find something that the child likes and that we can do together. And so the motivation is totally different. It's not me with, an M&M or iPad video or something unrelated. I'm trying to find, what do you like? And then how can I join you in that activity? And now once we're playing together and we have found an activity that the child likes and we can do together, I'm going to try and teach the child or show the child some new things within that play-based context. So if we're playing with cars and this child is maybe working on communication skills, which is a common goal for kids with autism, I might be modeling language like go, 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 stop, or talking about the colors of the cars or the size of the cars or the cars going up and down a ramp. And all of my teaching or all of the things that I'm modeling are going to be related to that activity. And the idea is, if the child is sufficiently motivated and they like that activity, we can teach all the skills that a child might need to learn within that play-based context. The reason why we're so confident in that is because that's how kids learn kind of across the board, regardless of diagnoses. Young kids, 1 to 5 years old, learn through play, exploration, and really exploring their environment, sometimes with other people and sometimes on their own. So ESDM is really trying to bring the type of teaching and the type of learning that we are hoping that will connect with a child with autism to a play-based and kind of naturalistic context that looks and mirrors a situation that any child might be in and might find motivating and interesting.
That's awesome. I could definitely echo that as well. As a therapist myself, I think a good therapist recognizes the value in play, right? And exploration, because that's where our natural learning just tends to happen. So even with my therapy sessions, it's the same way. Like we have those first couple sessions, sometimes even a month, where we're just kind of building rapport with that child, seeing what they like, building a relationship at the end of the day, right? We're just kind of trying to build a relationship. And from there, we kind of, how can we start to challenge them now that the relationship is here? And that's where some of that learning happens naturally through play. So I just could definitely resonate with that. So thanks for sharing that. So I kind of want to go forward and say, okay, if I'm a parent and this ABA approach sounds appealing to me, where do I start? Some things that kind of come to my head is, what ages do you guys see? Do you guys accept insurances? What about diagnosis? Does my child need to have a certain diagnosis?
Yeah, all great questions. So ESDM is the type. We practice ESDM based therapy at Soar, but Soar is also not the only place you can get ESDM based therapy. So if you're a family and you're outside of Phoenix or Denver areas and you're interested in this type of therapy, you can go to the ESDM website. It's esdm.co. And there is a whole list of registered therapists and certified therapists who have demonstrated and gone through very specific and rigorous training who can deliver ESDM therapy. So there's a worldwide network of ESDM trainers and therapists that families can reach out to. If it's a family who's coming to SOAR, we typically serve kids who are anywhere from 2 to 5 years old. Sometimes we'll serve kids who are a little older than that. However, usually that's kids who are getting ready for school and kind of getting ready to transition to school. The early start dimmer model is really specialized in that it's really designed to be developmentally appropriate for young kids, and that's the population that we focus on. At SOAR, we do take all major insurance, including Medicaid and most commercial insurance plans. Our intake team can tell you a little bit more about how to navigate that process, but we take most commercial insurance and Medicaid, which is really important to me, that we can serve families from a lot of different backgrounds and diverse experiences. So I'm really proud that we can do that. And once you reach out to the SOAR team, we have a lot of different centers in the Denver and Phoenix areas. We try and have them spread out in a way that, a family has a center within a reasonable distance to their house. And we get you connected with the team there. And usually the first step is making sure that a family feels comfortable that this type of therapy is right for them. So we invite families to come to our centers and do a tour. We, describe our therapy to families in a lot of detail first, and make sure that families feel, one, it matches up with their values, and two, it can be helpful, or they feel like it'll be helpful for their child. So once they do that, we then set up a assessment. And we use what's called the Early Start Denver Model Curriculum Checklist, which is a developmentally informed checklist that really looks at all developmental domains for a child. So we are not a therapy provider that just focuses on communication or just focuses on play. We really try and assess kids across all developmental domains. And to do that well, we don't just have BCBAs who are trying to do that. We have SLPs and OTs, speech language pathologists and occupational therapists, who work at our centers as well and help us with their specialty domains too. And so we try and get a really comprehensive picture of this child's developmental profile. And all of that assessment is done through play. So the assessment is not something where, again, there's not sitting at a table, there's no flashcards that we're doing drills with. This is a play-based assessment. We have occupational therapy gyms at all of our centers, so we make sure we get in there, get a picture of this child's motor skills, their sensory profile. Our SLPs help us get a really complete picture of their communication profile too, and often evaluate if AAC is appropriate or a pathway we might want to go down for a child. And then we write up a comprehensive report that really documents and sets goals with the family around the different developmental domains and where we want to focus our attention for that child. And then we typically get to work from there.
Awesome. So I think that kind of gives us an idea of kind of what happens. I want to backtrack a little bit. If I am a parent and I'm not sure if my child needs ABA, but I recognize like something's going on, there are certain behaviors, whatever, what would you say might be some red flag behaviors or just some things to be like, hey, maybe I should get an assessment from you guys, Soar?
Yeah, for sure. So I think as you mentioned, autism is super individualized. And so it really depends on that child and that family. And the first thing I would usually ask families to do is to one, reflect with the people that know and love this child and what are this child's strengths? What are they really excelling at? And then maybe where are they seeing some of those things that are more challenging for that child? And sometimes that can include talking to an existing team of professionals who know this child, maybe a pediatrician, maybe if they're in the early intervention system, they're early intervention providers. Some families have outside speech and OT that they're already connected with. I really ask families to, reflect and talk to the people that know this child the best. I would say common signs that a child might benefit from coming to SOAR or engaging with our model are kind of clustered in a few areas. One, we really help children learn to communicate and to advocate for themselves a lot. And so if you have a child who is maybe struggling with communication or is getting frustrated by a lack of their lack of ability to communicate their wants and needs to you, I think that could be a sign that potentially intervention could be helpful for them. I think sometimes that frustration can look a few ways. It might just look like, a tantrum or like an autistic meltdown of totally shutting down and not being able to kind of move forward in the day. It can also sometimes manifest in terms of leaving an area in public, like, kind of getting distracted by something and going to check that out. And then, aggression and self-injury are also some common behaviors that we see from kids with autism, but usually it is because there's a communication breakdown that's happening. It's that they're trying to tell us something, we're not hearing their message. And so they might resort to these behaviors that are scary and even potentially dangerous. But we always seek to kind of understand the why, like why is this happening, and work with the family to do that too. So I would say communication, some of those kind of challenging behaviors that can come up. And then oftentimes another area that a family might notice is that they're trying to join their child in play. They might be trying to engage with their child, but they feel like they're having a hard time breaking into their world. They might feel like they're having a hard time understanding why that child might like to play differently, or how they can be a part of the play and show the child some fun and exciting things with toys. Sometimes kids with autism might play with toys in a different way than a typically developing child would. And that's cool. But it can be hard to break in and to kind of play with them in some instances because their play might seem different or unique, and a parent could struggle to kind of interpret that. So we try and work with families to help families understand why a child might be interested in playing that way and kind of how they can be a part of it too.
Love that. It sounds like I'm going to just recap some of those things. So
thing.
If I'm a parent, maybe I have difficulties kind of being able to understand my child or connect with them. You're seeing frustrations, meltdown, maybe issues with transitions, and aggression and self-injury are some of those things that you kind of pointed out there. But I also want to reemphasize this, and I think you're going to agree with this 100% because of the work you do, is just the emphasis that all behavior is a form of communication. So when we do speak about behavior, it's not necessarily like, oh, this is bad or you're bad. It's more just that a lot of times kids are able to communicate their needs and their emotions and whatnot. So a lot of times these behaviors look like their form of communication. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. Couldn't agree more, Brian. And I think for families, it can feel quite out. I hear families often say, this comes out of the blue. I don't know why this is happening. We'll be having kind of a typical day, and then this behavior will seem like it comes out of nowhere, and I don't know what to do. And so this idea of seeking to understand the why and then trying to understand what that child is trying to tell us is really, really core to how we can help that child communicate their message in a more effective way, which could be through using an AAC device, sometimes through sign language, sometimes through pointing or gestures, or even, kids learn, like, I just got to, pull mom or dad's arm over to what I'm trying to get. But oftentimes kids with autism learn that their ways they're trying to communicate might not be effective, so they go to these sort of unconventional ways that can be some of the behaviors that you listed. But I do just want to point out that, things like aggression and self-injury are not part of the diagnostic criteria for autism. They're not innate or core to an autistic person's identity. They don't have to be there necessarily. Oftentimes I find that there's something like an accident of learning. The child learns, hey, this is a way I can communicate my wants and needs because these other ways I've tried aren't effective. And so really trying to help understand that situation and figure out the why and how they can communicate those wants and needs more effectively is really core to what we do in ESDM-based therapy and our approach of SOAR. We spend a lot of time in our assessments trying to figure out the why and how we might help that child learn some other ways that they can communicate the same message.
We have a child, we bring them in. Does a child need to have an autism diagnosis to see you guys, or could it be anything? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, great question. Unfortunately, it depends a little bit on their insurance plan and the state that the child lives in. And I wish those two things weren't the case, but some insurance providers have a requirement that a child must have autism in order to receive the therapy that we provide. In Colorado, for example, Colorado Medicaid does not require the diagnosis of autism to receive services. And some other payers are a little bit different. Some other insurance funders are a little different. And so I would encourage, if a family is curious about it, to talk to their insurance provider about what are the limitations on access to therapy, because it does vary a little bit. We see most of the kids that we serve do have an autism diagnosis, but not all of them do. We have kids that have different diagnoses again. And unfortunately, access to care is kind of individualized by the insurance plan. But we see kids who have a variety of needs and diagnoses, most commonly autism, but not only autism.
All right. One other question kind of related to your guys' services. I bring my child in and now and then all the assessments have been done, like you talked about. What does that look like after that treatment-wise? How long you're at a clinic? How long could those sessions be? Are we in there 1 hour a day, 8 hours a day, 4 hours a day, and how many days a week? Can you give me an idea kind of what that range looks like and what a parent could expect from that?
Totally. Great question. The first thing I'll say is that we are not a 40-hour a week for every child center. That's not the model that we practice. There are a lot of ABA providers that practice that model, that have kids in the center all day, every day, and that's the only thing they offer. Just to be clear, we don't do that at SOAR. Our clinical recommendations are individualized based on the results of the assessment. And so typically what we'll do is the BCBA, SLP, and OT will kind of huddle up. We'll go through the assessment together, see where we have, see this kind of child's developmental profile, and then make a clinical recommendation from there. We do have some kids that are in what I would call more intensive therapy, which would probably be, 5 or 6 hours a day at our centers. That also includes speech, OT, and sometimes a nap if a child naps. So it's not all therapy all the time. I just wanted to put that out there. But it can really range depending on the child and their needs. And so we have some kids who are in preschool and they come to SOAR after preschool for a couple hours in the afternoon. And then we have kids who are there for kind of a more like comprehensive or full day and may see their speech occupational therapist at SOAR, take a nap at SOAR, have lunch, like do all of those routines here with us. And so it really depends on the family's values around what they're looking for and the clinical recommendation of the team. We do ask that when the team makes a clinical recommendation, we do talk to families about there can be risks if the family wants something that's really low intensity, for example, and the clinical team is saying, hey, this child needs to see an occupational therapist maybe 3 times a week to really benefit from the services. We do talk to families about trying to meet in the middle there, but want to have a balance of family preference and values, clinical recommendations, and then coming to a schedule that works for everybody from there. But a lot of kids at SOAR go to school, go to other therapies, have other things going on in their day. And we are not a provider that requires families to drop everything else and only come to SOAR. And that's something that I really like to emphasize, because unfortunately that is a common model in the ABA community, which frankly, I have some problems with. So I'm glad we're more individualized with our approach.
I like that a lot. Definitely similar values at Peer Hearts Therapy, where we definitely want to be family-centered, client-centered, because that's just being culturally relevant. We all have our own opinions, but that doesn't mean it's going to be what the family believes in. And I think as a good clinicians, we should be respecting our family's values.
Totally agree.
So let's jump into, since this is the Autism Family Resource, let's jump into this last part, neurodiversity. Like I mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of backlash with ABA from autistic voices. Obviously, it's probably not everybody, but there's some people who said it's been traumatizing. As a clinic at SOAR, how would you guys say that you guys are neurodiversity affirming?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a complicated question. And so I'll give my perspective on the topic. I think it's one we could probably have a whole podcast on, Brian, and I'd be happy to do it another time too. I think there's a few ways we try and emphasize neurodiversity affirming care at SOAR. One is always seeking to understand the child before we put in place any intervention. Two is really trying to make sure that any interventions or therapy that we do match up with that child's values and that family's values. When we're working with really young kids, we try really hard to include the child in goal setting and evaluating kind of what they might want to work on and need to work on. But oftentimes, frankly, when we're working with a 2-year-old, that does come from the family advocating for their child and their needs. And then the other ones are more therapy specific, and there's really kind of two buckets that those fall in. One is we try always to measure and monitor what I'll call assent and child assent as part of our therapy process. And that means we look for assent is kind of another way to say consent. Consent is something adults provide. Assent is something we look for in kids, which are basically indications that they are assenting or willingly and excitedly participating in therapy. And for some kids, that might look like saying, let's go play. For other kids, we might call those like approach behaviors or indicating responses like smiling, handing a toy to an adult. We look for these signs that this child is happy, relaxed, and engaged with us, and we're not seeing signs of distress or upset or frustration. And we train our staff when they see those things to stop rather than to push through. There are forms of ABA that say we're going to follow through regardless of the child's kind of thoughts and feelings about it. And we try and be very assent focused at SOAR, where we do not do that. If a child is saying, I don't want to do that with their voice or their body, we train our staff to stop and try and understand why, and then help that child kind of provide assent to continue in the activity or alternate or kind of adjust and change our plan or approach for that child. So that means, if we're going to go, our rooms at SOAR all have different themes. So we have like a dino room, for example. It's a very popular one. If we go, hey, we're going to go in a dino room, and a child stops in the doorway and kind of tenses up their body, we're not going to say, get in here. We're going to stop and say, okay, is it that they don't know what might happen in the dino room? Is it that we need to maybe get out some toys and show them what the options are in here? Or is it that the dinosaur picture on the wall is frightening to that child, maybe, and we need to select a different room? And we try and teach our staff to really go through that decision-making process and not just to press forward, because we said it, we have to do it. We don't practice that kind of ABA at SOAR. Right. The other key difference in our model is that we are very, very intentional about how we respond to challenging behavior. And by challenging behavior, I'm saying things like aggression, self-injury, some of those sort of behavioral indicators of frustration that we talked about earlier. It's really common still in ABA clinics to be trained to restrain kids. And I know that's hard to hear, but that's really common in other centers. We do not do that at SOAR. We provide zero restraint training, and we take what we call like a hands-off approach to responding to challenging behavior. So that means if a child is refusing to do something, or they're getting maybe they got upset by something, and we might see some of those things like self-injury or aggression, we are not employing any restraints or anything that would resemble a restraint in response to those behaviors. And that might seem like common sense to not do that, but unfortunately in our field, it's not yet common sense. And so it is something that I like to emphasize to parents is like, no one is going to make your child do something that they don't want to do. and no one is going to put their hands on your child while they're at SOAR. We have really clear lines that we will not do those things. I think there's other components of our care that are really neurodiversity affirming too, which are, again, incorporating the child's interest, seeking to understand what that child likes and wants to do before we jump into therapy, as well as making sure our goals and recommendations are really meaningful and valuable to that person and their family. But that was a long answer, so I'll stop there. I think those are kind of the key ways we try and think about neurodiversity and neurodiversity affirming care at SOAR.
I really appreciate that answer. I think you kind of hit it on a nail, and I think you guys are doing great. And definitely props to kind of going against the grain and definitely challenging yourself and challenging everybody there, because I'm sure it's not easy, right? If people are set in certain ways. So definitely says a lot that you guys are like, hey, this isn't always the way it's been done, but we're going to try this way and keep learning, right?
Yeah, absolutely. If I could just make one other comment on neurodiversity affirming care, Brian, I think the other thing is around goal selection that's really important. There is this idea, I think one of the big points of friction between the autistic community and ABA providers is this idea that ABA providers are trying to normalize a child. They're trying to take away their autistic identity and replace it with a neurotypical identity. And we try and be very, very thoughtful about understanding that perspective and understanding how our goals, even unintentionally, might be doing that. And so when we talk about teaching a child to communicate, we try very hard and work with our SLP team to not assign different values to different forms of communication, meaning not saying that verbal speech is better than sign language or better than selecting something on an iPad. We try and say whatever this child is comfortable with and is most effective for them is the modality that we might move forward with. And we hope that is a way that we can help this child advocate for themselves more, develop the skills that they need to be independent in the communities that they live in without trying to strip away some of those core components of autistic identity, like using AAC, like self-stimulatory behavior for ways to regulate or cope or even just for fun, and really recognizing where we are being helpful but not taking away from that person's core identity or things that they really love.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. So, like I said, on the last one, definitely appreciate you guys for really taking that approach and those goals. And yeah, we're all different, right? That's the beautiful thing about neurodiversity, right? It empowers everyone's unique differences. And it sounds like you guys are going the right direction with that.
We're trying.
So, Will, let's finish this up. Give me one last takeaway or message for our families listening now.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sticking with us to this point. I think could be my first message for families. And then second, I would say take a really thoughtful approach when you're selecting a provider and feel empowered to ask tough questions about what type of therapy and what type of approach you might experience at different providers. I think historically access to care has been really limited for families. And so families have kind of taken any provider that will see them because they're just trying to get help for their child. I'm optimistic now that that's changing quite a bit, and families are starting to ask hard questions to providers. And so I would encourage families to be really thoughtful about what their values are as a family and making sure that any individual provider, whether it's a BCBA, SLP, OT, early interventionist, is providing therapy that really matches up with the values of that family. One way we try and do that is we have an open door policy, so families can come into any session at any time and check in on what we're doing. And some providers don't do that. And I think that's kind of a flag. It would be a flag for me to say, why can't I see this therapy and what's going on here? Definitely. And so would really encourage families to just, think about their goals and their values for their family and for their child, and to feel empowered to ask providers some of those hard questions around how there might be alignment or misalignment between the two.
Definitely. I would agree with that 100%. Well, thank you, Will, for being on the show. I really enjoyed this conversation, and good luck in all future endeavors.
Thank you for having me, Brian. Really appreciate it.
I hope you guys appreciate that conversation with Will. I know I did. I really love the fact that SOAR really emphasizes individualism, strength-based approaches, making sure they're family and culturally sensitive, and using intrinsic motivation. I think those are all neurodiversity affirming and respecting every member's specific needs and values, right? Because I think that a lot of times that doesn't always happen, especially in the ABA world. Some families have had great approaches. So I'm not saying that all people haven't, but some people have also had some not as great experiences. So I really think that they're on the right track. And then right after our recording, me and Will had a short little conversation, and I figured I would tap into that real quick. What the conversation had to do with very traditional style families where it's very authoritative and a little bit more rigid. I think like kind of military. Will has worked with military families, and I used to be a military, so I definitely get that frame of reference. So if you find yourself in that framework and you're kind of listening and thinking like, what the heck is going on? These therapists sound like pushovers. It's a free for all. My kids needs discipline. I hear where you're coming from. My response to that is it's not probably the way you're thinking about it. There definitely is structure, and at least the way we do therapy, to where we have outcomes that we're trying to reach, but it may not look like a neurotypical approach. So I'm gonna give a quick example. If we wanted to have a goal of cooking a simple meal, our goal is still to cook a simple meal, but we're going to find different ways to adapt that meets that person's needs. So maybe we use pictures instead of word instructions. Maybe we skip some instructions that aren't valid for that person, or maybe we need to add extra instructions. So we're still getting to the end goal, but it's kind of catered toward that person or to that individual. And it's not so rigid in the way we do things, and we're respecting their boundaries. So I just figured I'd point that one out for people who are kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum as far as how therapy should look like. But we respect all families. So I just wanted to end with that. The resources in this show are designed to empower your family to thrive. I believe in the power of a community for growth and learning. So let's stay connected. Follow Pure Hearts Therapy on social media, where I'd love to hear from you and answer any questions you have. You'll find all the links, contact information, and more in the show notes. Just scroll down in your podcast player or visit Pure Hearts Therapy for everything in one place. Thanks for tuning in to the Autism Family Resource Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe for more tools to help your family live their best lives. Catch you next time.